Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just talked about both of the NBA games from last night. Now I want to switch to a little bit more of the news front, as we got some news from the Suns yesterday where they fired head coach Frank Vogel after just one season. They brought him in on a 5-year deal last offseason in early June, and now are already done with him less than a full year later. So they have already named his replacement. They bring in Mike Budenholzer, so we're going to touch on that a little bit more in depth in a moment here. But the Suns are now going to be heading into their third consecutive season with a different head coach. They've had 6 in the last 10 years, so this organization has just constantly been cycling through these head coaches, and even when it seemed like they had one in Monty Williams, they end up parting ways there because of the fact that it comes down to this postseason success. Even though Monty Williams was part of the group that was able to bring the Suns to the finals in 2021, they felt like they were underachieving. There was definitely a lot of friction. I know, at least on the DeAndre Ayton front. Now, they end up trading Ayton in the offseason anyways, but they just continue to cycle through all of these different head coaches. It seems like that organization has, ever since really that season where they brought in Chris Paul and made that finals run, they have definitely been struggling with a level of consistency and I think to some degree a level of accountability. Sort of alluded to that earlier in the show, but a level of accountability with their star players. Now, I don't include Devin Booker in the conversation quite as much, even though you can make an argument that he has been with, I want to say, at least 6 different head coaches since he was drafted. I believe possibly going into number 7. Again, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I want to sort of point to Kevin Durant here, where, at least an interesting note, I'm not saying he was responsible for Vogel getting fired himself, but KD is now going to be playing under his 6th head coach in 6 seasons next year. It was Kenny Atkinson when he first came to Brooklyn, was obviously dealing with injuries in that first year, so don't know how much you can really put on him there. But then he advocates for bringing in Steve Nash, and then by the next offseason is already sort of disassociated with him, was making some power trips in terms of the front office, saying either one of you got to go or I'm going to go, plays half the season there. Once Kyrie bails, he does as well, and is now sort of shuffling through the Phoenix head coaches as well. So, I defend Kevin Durant, I think, more than the average person in terms of the talent that he is. Specifically, that decision, I don't love it, but I understand the move to Golden State more than most people do, I feel like, and I've talked about it plenty on this podcast, so I don't necessarily want to dive into all of it once again, but as much slack as LeBron James gets for having his head coaches fired, we have seen Kevin Durant really cycling through these head coaches. He has had more head coaches than any other player in the NBA over the last 10 years. It's going to be 9, I believe, when Mike Budenholzer takes over. No, 9 can't be right, but I think it's 8, maybe going on 9. It's been a lot, to say the least, for Kevin Durant over the past decade. And as for the team decision, because again, don't know necessarily who exactly is responsible for the Vogel hiring. It seems like Ishbia and that front office itself is also sort of treading water, having problems in this new regime. But I didn't think the Suns even really had a bad regular season. They win 49 games. They're dealing with Devin Booker injuries early on. Brad Beal was also struggling to stay on the court there. For whatever that's worth, I know that a lot of people are very soured on Brad Beal because of how the playoffs turned out. I was never necessarily all that high on him to begin with coming into the year, but it was this shuffling of the cards of what we've seen from the year prior, and obviously Vogel wasn't a part of that 2023 team, but, still though, feels like there was a lot of meshing that had to take place on the court, especially considering the fact that the roster construction wasn't necessarily all that friendly for trying to get all these players to build up chemistry. They had problems far beyond just the chemistry of their top 3 players, because they were dealing with no real point guard, and it wasn't really a real big man game. Again, I feel like I like Nurkic maybe a little bit more than the average NBA fan, and they didn't have much off of the bench whatsoever. So, as for Vogel in this season, again, 49 wins in the Western Conference for how deep it was is very solid, especially when they were facing playoff teams in each of their last 10 games of the regular season, and they were able to stay above, actually pull themselves out of the play-in threshold to at least guarantee them a postseason spot. And I think that Vogel has probably been one of the, more underappreciated, I guess you can say, coaches. Now, I'm not saying he's any sort of a mastermind, but it seems like he has had a tough stretch here of being the scapegoat. I think that that's what he was in LA when he was fired from the Lakers, and now I think that that's what's happening here in Phoenix as well. And it comes down to the postseason production here, obviously, and if they are able to, I don't know, I'm curious how many games they would have had to win against the Timberwolves for him to keep his job. He seemed pretty confident that he was going to be able to retain his job for a while there, but obviously that's not the case. And, again, as this Timberwolves postseason pushes on, I know that a lot of people are sort of clamoring for the idea of apologizing to the Suns because, maybe they're not quite as bad as we thought, and they were given a lot of slack because of getting swept. I'm not really of that belief. I do think that there are real problems with this team. The flaws that we saw during the regular season showed up in the postseason again. And all of those things that I listed, the fact that they were the worst fourth quarter team in the league, they didn't know how to close out games. And again, I do think that in large part it boils down to the fact that they didn't have any true playmaker to be able to run their offense, and they were relying heavily on the individual shot creation of their star players, especially considering that one of their star players is Bradley Beal, who is making $50+ million over the next few seasons for the Suns, and is just not the same level of all-star, all-NBA caliber player that he was for a lot of his career. So I don't really know how a coaching change here is going to rectify this situation for the Suns. Now, there were reports that Vogel maybe didn't mesh with his players well, likely talking about Durant, Booker, and Beal. So if that is the case, that definitely played a role. Like I mentioned, the whole Kevin Durant, 6 coaches in 6 seasons. Who is he really going to mesh with? Because, him and Steve Nash were supposedly, really close in him getting his first ever head coaching job, and then he just turned very quickly on that in a year. So I'm not really sure what the deal is going to be there. Now, the Suns are a mess with or without Vogel. They don't have much of a future considering all of the draft capital that they've traded off in recent years in order to create this roster that has all of the star power for it, but doesn't necessarily have the logical means to be able to be a championship contender, at least as things currently stand in May. Maybe they have some sort of historic offseason where they pull something off, but I find that a little bit hard to believe. They don't have any control over their draft picks until 2031. Now, they're going to have some first-round picks along the way there. Most of them, if not all of them, involved in pick swaps, so we will see with that. They also enter next year paying out a ton of money to their current roster, $209 million. Again, that's just in May. That's prior to making any type of offseason moves. But that $209 million is the most expensive out of any other team in the league. I think that it's going to be an extremely tough task for them here to come back from it. But either way, Vogel is out. They bring in Mike Budenholzer. They officially hired him Friday morning. So on the note of sort of that fit, I do find it interesting to see, Budenholzer is somebody who has a reputation of being a little bit stubborn at times. That's what helped lead to his undoing in Milwaukee. But at the same time, we saw Budenholzer be able to lead the Bucks to that 2021 championship, and he has multiple Coach of the Year awards under his belt as well. So I do believe that he is somebody who can absolutely be capable of at least trying to rectify the situation. Curious what defensively, because obviously one of the most famous things about Budenholzer is his defensive philosophies, the heavy drop coverage. Now, you don't have a Brook Lopez necessarily in the paint to be the same level of a rim protector, but I do think that Nurkic at times can, flash some positive things, so I'm curious how that's going to fit into the equation. Again, I don't know how much the vibes per se in terms of Vogel didn't mesh with his players. Like, what is going to unlock? And maybe it's Bradley Beal just being, more healthy and being able to sort of find a little bit of a vintage version of himself. If they are able to go out and find a point guard somewhere along the way, that would be huge. They just don't really have the resources for it either. Now, Devin Booker has absolutely improved on his playmaking over the recent seasons, so I don't know if I ever see him as a true point guard, but if he can at least run a little bit more of a team offense, that would be a positive development for the Suns. I think that they are very much handicapped, and I'm not really sure how this is going to get better for the Suns, not just this season, but if it's not this season, they don't really have a future. They need to capitalize now. Puts a ton of pressure on Budenholzer. Speaking of pressure, I'm a little bit surprised that he ended up taking this job, but there is at least NBA-ready talent, and the options for him were between this and the Los Angeles Lakers, where he was the frontrunner to be the next Lakers head coach. Now, that's obviously not the case, so the Lakers remain on the search for a head coach. I know that at least odds-wise, I forget exactly which sports book I was looking at. I think it was DraftKings, that JJ Redick was second in terms of head coaching odds to be with the Lakers, and Budenholzer was at the top of the list, but Redick was number 2. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Lakers sort of play this out. If you're JJ Redick, I don't know necessarily if this is the real time you want to make your step into coaching. Now, obviously, he has that reputation or relationship, I should say, with LeBron James anyways, that I'm sure he would have some level of respect already walking in the room there. But that is quite the spot to walk into that I'm just not really sure if that is the way to go for him. Other names out there, at least, there's been the Ty Lue sort of rumors that have circulated out there, but it sounds like there's mutual interest from both Lue and the Clippers to bring him back, so not really sure there. There was some buzz earlier this week about how multiple teams, not the Lakers specifically, but multiple teams, if the Timberwolves were to part ways with Chauncey Billups, that could be a potential landing spot. Would definitely be an interesting one for me. I could potentially get behind that. And then the other one is Kevin Young. I don't necessarily know all too much about Young. He was definitely in a lot of head coaching conversations last offseason. He was the lead assistant behind Monty Williams in Phoenix before he was fired there. So we could potentially see Young end up with the Lakers, but I don't think that is going to happen necessarily. If I'm not mistaken, Young may have just taken a job in college as well. So again, it's just kind of messy here and for the Lakers moving forward. And I'm not saying, ultimately for the Lakers, the head coach probably isn't their number one issue. I know that Darvin Ham was definitely sort of torn to shreds on his way out of LA, and I wasn't a fan of Ham myself, but I feel like you just need to have some level of competency there, and the Lakers could be at least in the conversation of being fun. I just feel like their championship window may have already passed them. Obviously, when you have the talent of both LeBron James and Anthony Davis, you can't fully count them out, but I'm definitely not counting them in myself. But let me know what you think about this. Should Frank Vogel have been fired from the Phoenix Suns? How is Mike Budenholzer going to help the team moving forward? And what should the Lakers do with their head coaching vacancy now that their number one option is off the board? But we are going to now be taking our final break of the show. And when we come back on the other side, I want to give some updates on the injuries surrounding both the Knicks' OG Anunoby and Jalen Brunson, and sort of have a bigger discussion about this Knicks postseason run. So stick with us, and we will be right back.